This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
We launched our seminar series on the topic of the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted just a couple of weeks ago at the UN General Assembly. The SDGs, as many of you will know, are meant to replace the Millennium Development Goals, which shape global development policy for 2000 to 2015. The SDGs are a bit bigger, a bit longer, and more complex, I think, as we'll find out. You can see image behind our speakers here of the 17 goals that comprise the new framework. And there are 169 targets, ranging from number 1, end poverty in all its forms everywhere, to things like promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. It's a combination in the goals of economic and social development aims, strategies for protection of the environment, and then macro issues like changes in global financial architecture. One of the key messages of the SDGs has been leave no one behind and to address inequalities. And this certainly raises the question of what is the role that human rights can play in this new agenda. Now, looking back at the MDGs, they certainly were not without their critics of human rights. And civil society, in elaborating this new framework, has been lobbying hard to see a human rights perspective integrated therein. So one of our questions tonight is, have they succeeded in doing that? We have invited 4 esteemed experts in this area to give us their insights into how the new framework reflects human rights, how it can be used to achieve human rights, and whether opportunities for human rights have been missed in the final package. All of our actors tonight have been directly involved in elaborating this framework, the post-2015 agenda, including following many of the processes over the past years to try and influence the outcome. So now that they've actually been adopted, we can hear their real views about what they think about the final framework. And I've asked them to reflect on different dimensions of the SDG framework, reflecting their own areas of expertise. So brief introductions. We don't have time to go into the full detail of all of the activities that our guests have done, but needless to say, they have between them decades of experience of working on human rights and development issues at the national and international level. To my far left is Priya Nath, who's the Global Policy and Advocacy Advisor on post-2015 for VSO. And also she serves on the advisory board of the Gender and Development Network, which has been very involved in the post-2015 agenda. Next to her is Neva Frecheville, who is leading Analyst for post-2015 for CAFOD. And she also has been participating in the executive committee of the Beyond 2015 coalition of NGOs that have been shaping the agenda as well. Next to her is Savio Carvalho, who is Senior Advisor on Campaigning on International Development and Human Rights for Amnesty International, and has been involved in this process, including being at New York very recently for the last, to see the SDGs adopted. And then finally we have Vernon, who's Director of Programs and Acting CEO of International Alert. He's led international rights advocacy on post-2015, and you'll find on our reading list a couple of publications that he has drafted reflecting on this framework from a peace and human rights perspective. So I've asked each of them to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up to discussion. I'd like to invite Savio to start, then Priya, then Phil, and Neva.
Thank you, Corinne. Thank you for inviting us, and so good evening. I've been asked to sort of focus on 2 specific issues. One is...
Just going to make sure it's running. Yes.
Brilliant. Everything is recorded here. Freedom of expression. One is around sort of what have you done, how have you come, what's the journey from 2010 till 2015, and what have you learned through this journey. And the second one is around, second part, on can we use the SDGs for human rights? Can we use it to further human rights itself? So I'll just sort of quickly go through the first part and say, and I speak a bit for Amnesty International, but also a bit for the Human Rights Caucus, that, is a group of around 80 organizations, no secretariat, no sort of funding. It's just people who have come together to sort of work on post-2015. So in 2010, when Amnesty sort of started looking at this, a lot of people sort of told us, forget it. Human rights in SDGs, forget it. Including sort of, in the High Commissioner's office, said this is not going to be, it's not an easy sell. Max you would get is one reference to human rights. And at that time in 2010, we were anyway quite upset with the MDGs itself, saying that this framework has lowered human rights standards. And we did a bit of reflection. We said that the SDGs, or post 2015, would be either an opportunity or a threat to our existing work. An opportunity because if all governments and donors and everybody start signing up to this framework, then we could push human rights through it. It could be a threat that if it doesn't have human rights and still everybody signs up to it, then we have another problem to deal with. So we already have governments who don't want to work on human rights, and now we have the SDGs. So we thought it's in balance. Let's dip our toe in this and see what happens. And then I fast forwarded to Rio Plus 20, where for the first time people are saying, what is the Amnesty and Human Rights Watch doing in Rio? It's an environment group. And Navi Pillai, the then Human Rights Commissioner, actually in a public event said, thanks to Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, you have actually raised the bar of human rights in this summit. So it was like just to tell people that we have to break through silos and work across different sort of groupings and sectoral grouping itself. And then came the lovely high-level panel, which the UK Prime Minister was the co-chair, and then you had the open working group, and then you had the negotiation. So that was the way things moved. So a couple of things that really stood out in this 5-year journey. One was breaking through silos. We soon realized that the human rights community generally is known to be quite arrogant, that we don't work with anybody else, we work with ourselves. And we said, no, we need to start working with the development group, environmental groups, labor unions. So we need to cut through silos, because people need to start realizing that human rights is not that techie. At the same time, everybody has something to play for in human rights. So that was like the first learning on day one. The second one was to sort of form into coalitions. Human rights groups love to see black and white. There is no gray in human rights. But the moment you work on economic, social, and cultural rights, there is a gray. And we had to feel comfortable with the gray. We had to feel comfortable, like if a mother dies during childbirth due to preventable problems, it's not just obligation of the state and a violation by the state itself, but there is something else that's happening. Did she go to school? Did she get the right medical treatment? Did the ambulance work that day? Was there a road? Lots of stuff. You just can't say the government has violated somebody's human rights. So I think we were dealing with some of the grey part of it. So that was the second learning, that be comfortable with the grey. Don't reduce human rights standards, but feel a bit confident with the grey, because the environment movement will push the grey, and the development guys will say, listen, we have programs to the ground, don't upset the government, we have staff at risk, fair enough. So that's the grey. How do you deal with the grey? The third one was around finding common grounds, for finding common language. So nobody would oppose a language of participation. Nobody would oppose a language of non-discrimination. Nobody would oppose a language of, we need the rule of law, we need accountability. And people say, we need accountability. You go to an Oxfam and they say, accountability, yes, it's important. But you go to the same groups around and say, we need to work, the framework has to be built on human rights. Oh, okay, what's that about? So we had to change language. We had to use language that is adaptable, people can work, align with, people can understand, but at the same time, you still hold the human rights values and principles. And finally, something we had to be careful about is we did not want anybody to be mouthpieces of government's foreign policies. And so whilst we worked with this whole bunch of people, we also knew that a lot of groups get funding from governments, including this government and its arms to DFID, which is, has long tentacles. So how do you ensure that the foreign policy does not, or government's policy does not dictate objectivity through these groups that the government funds? And we had to be careful of that. And we, even till the New York negotiations 2 months ago, we were confronting that sort of that energy or negative energy, or what you would call it. So those were the sort of broad learnings. And at the same time, we had groups like Beyond 2015 that Neva was, involved in the leadership. We had the Human Rights Caucus. So we had groups that emerged, and all of us worked alongside. And I think that was a success. And so those were some of the sort of quick learnings where one doesn't compromise, one works together, but at the same time, there is a bit of flexibility. Moving on to the second part of it, in terms of what have we learned, or can we use the SDGs per se? This morning I was working on the indicators, and I must say I have a sinking feeling today. Like this morning, when you looked at the indicators and looked at, brilliant, we have the SDGs, or everybody is sort of, singing and dancing and tom-tomming, and it's Christmas time. But when you look at the SDG process, you say like, hey, these are indicators, and why is there lack of transparency? Why, they've selected 50 people, including myself. On what basis have we been selected to go to Bangkok for this meeting? Who has decided this? What are the criteria? So immediately SDGs are over and we are back into the domain of lack of transparency. There's no draft. The meeting is 2 weeks from now. We haven't seen a new draft of what the indicators will be. And you would agree with me, indicators are the sharpest tool to measure success. And if this process itself is already gone into a process that lacks transparency, you know what's going to come. However, let's not be cynical. Let's sort of say, so what have we got in the SDGs right now? The first thing is we have got a couple of essential criteria. They're universal. So the North and the South, everybody has to work on the indicators, on the SDGs. Hopefully they work on it. Some governments have still been saying, oh, well, it's for the poorer countries, it's not for the rich countries. But okay, there's lots in the UK that the UK government has to work on. So it is universal. It speaks about non-discrimination. It has good text on non-discrimination. It has good language around civil and political rights. So you have language on freedoms, you have language on good governance, you have language on rule of law. However, these are not framed as human rights obligations, which is fine. I wish they were, but we could live with that. Moving on, in terms of transparency and participation, again, it gets a tick mark. You have the right language there: transparent institutions, participatory decision making, access to information, just name it, women's participation, people-centered approach, leaving no one behind, everything is there. Again, they are not referred to as human rights obligations, but they have kept the crucial part of monitoring, review, and accountability absolutely vague. That's one element that's the weakest link in this chain. So, for example, the Human Rights Caucus consistently asked the text to be really solid on accountability, but that's the only thing that they have sort of ignored. So they have actually kept follow-up and review. They first of all don't use the word, they use the word accountability I think once. They've stopped using the word accountability. It's monitoring, follow-up and review. So it's like, oh, we'll review the whole thing. So they've actually, first of all it's not legally binding, it's a political document, but there is no text, so there's no language to really hold governments to account. There is some acknowledgement to access to justice and to build accountable institutions. However, using human rights, internationally recognized human rights, and using a human rights framework to hold states responsible for their behavior beyond their borders is again ignored comfortably. So the whole thing on human rights beyond borders. The fourth one is around the private sector. The private sector, as you know, has been given a red carpet treatment. So fund, it sort of reduces the rich governments from their responsibility of the ODA, but there is no accountability of the private sector itself. There's no reference to the legally binding discussions that are going on in the Human Rights Council on transnational corporations. There is very little recognition on the harm that the private sector can do as they deliver these goals, and then who will hold them to account. None of that. So the private sector is given a red carpet, but there's no accountability of the private sector. The one on gender inequality is good, and Priya will talk to that. On inequality itself and end discrimination, again, we have seen some good language around non-discrimination, but crucial issues around redistribution of wealth, structural issues that this agenda actually sits on, and it makes this agenda complicated and interesting, have been ignored. And some of that was reflected in Addis Ababa, and we're not surprised that New York reflects that. We thought New York would actually learn some lessons. I think we were living in a fool's paradise, but being hopeful. But I think SDGs do not reflect any new commitments, any structural changes where you want to reduce inequalities between countries. That's been left out. Finally, on two other issues. One is on global partnership for development. That's another issue we're looking at, linked to Addis Ababa. You have some reference to technology transfer, technology mechanisms, but the whole thing on who will fund this $3 trillion. This is the money that they need. Who will fund this money? Is it governments? Is it government-private partnership? What's the mechanism around that? And is there accountability around that? Because that was the missing loop in the MDGs itself. And it looks like if we are not alert and active, this will be the missing loop in this framework itself. So the whole thing on global partnership requires more concrete commitments. This government in the UK, and I'm talking of UK because we all are in the UK right now, keeps on tom-tomming that we have reached our ODA commitment. But the amount of money that goes out and the amount of money that comes back in is a big question mark. So there's inequalities there, and there's some real structural issues that need to be addressed. So finally, just to conclude, I think moving ahead, we had the right text. We couldn't have asked for anything more. We are ambitious. We wanted a lot of language, but what we have got, I think, we have got 16 direct references to human rights. We are saying, okay, fair enough. But I think the biggest issue that we are grappling with is on accountability of this framework itself, at the national level, at the regional level, and at the global level. So the global level, they have this huge, humongous word called the high-level political forum that is not funded, that doesn't have a structure, that doesn't have a secretariat, that doesn't have staffing, and we have been calling for peer review mechanism to be used in the global framework. But at the regional level itself, at the national level itself, we haven't seen much traction on accountability of this framework, including big governments, so rich governments and the global north, or governments that have the capacity to do something like Mexico. So there are some governments who are grappling with it, and that's fair enough. But there are some governments say like, okay, it's all done, signed, it's business as usual. So I think if we can crack that part in the next 1 or 2 years, we would have the next 13 years as something that we can work with. But if we don't crack this in the next 2 years, we have lost this agenda. It will be another MDG saga, and we'll be back in 2030 where we were. So not to end on a cynical note, but on a more cautious note to say work is not over. It's not business as usual. There's stuff to be done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Savio. I think that was an excellent start for us and an important reminder of, in a human rights-based approach, the accountability pillar, which is so central to that approach, and obviously something that NGOs are looking at going forward. I'd like to invite now Priya to give us some comments on the gender dimensions of the SDGs. If you just minimize it, yours is on the desktop. Yeah, if you just close mine. Yeah, and then SDGs and women on the, yeah.
Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Priya, and like we said at the beginning, I'm representing BSO but also the Gender and Development Network, who has been working quite hard on the SDGs, influencing the SDGs and ensuring or working to make sure it has a strong focus on women and girls. So today I'm doing a little bit of an assessment about whether the SDGs deliver on the human rights in relation to gender, but most specifically in relation to women and girls' human rights. And unfortunately, to really analyse this, we have to look in detail at the language. So I apologise in advance for the really text-heavy presentation I'm about to do, but before I started working on the SDGs, I never really had to pay that much attention to language as I have had to in the last few years. And recognising that one word missing really just takes away a whole meaning or a whole commitment or changes it. So I'm going to stick to the facts of the language that we have ended up with. So let's start with what we have in the SDGs, what we kind of got at the end of this long process of negotiation that Savio has described. I think starting with Goal 5, which is specifically on achieving gender equality and empowering women and all women and girls. This is where we have to start. This is a standalone goal on gender equality and women's empowerment This in itself has been an achievement. Earlier in the discussions, earlier in the negotiations, there was a risk that this wouldn't actually eventuate, that gender equality and women and girls empowerment would be put into an inequalities goal or put into another area of the framework that would look at all inequalities equally. And so to get to the point where we have a standalone goal is an achievement, and I think it's progress, and it at least shows that there's no regression from the MDGs, which had a goal on gender equality. So this is something that we should and can be happy about. And it's also a pretty comprehensive goal at that. Like, it covers some very good areas, and I'm not going to go through all 9 targets that you can see up here that appear under the goal, but specifically I want to recognise that it has targets on things like violence against women and girls, on eliminating harmful practices, including FGM and early and enforced marriage, on recognising and valuing unpaid care and domestic work. And these are achievements, getting these targets in there. They go much further than the MDGs ever did. They bring in issues that we knew at the time of the MDGs, or people knew at the time of the MDGs, but there was just no political will or appetite to include them, a lot to do with the process that the MDGs followed to get to them. So I think these are really, and from my own organisation's perspective, the goal target 5.5 on women's full and effective participation in leadership and decision making, a lot more extensive than the MDG target ever was, and it looks at leadership and it looks at all levels, and that's something that we need to work with and need to kind of encourage. And then there's the language on sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights, which throughout the whole session or the whole few years of negotiation was always under attack. And the fact that, again, it managed to stay in there during 2 weeks of final negotiations in July is an achievement. So these are things that we should be kind of happy about and celebrate. There are also gender equality and women and girls empowerment elements mainstreamed through the rest of the framework, and I've just put out a few here. It got target 8.5, which is around equal pay for work of equal value, under the education goal, equal access to education, under target 6.3, the emphasis on women and girls and particular needs in hygiene and sanitation. I think as far as the Gender Development Network is concerned, and lots of women's rights agencies, mainstreaming didn't go far enough. There could have been a lot more in terms of actual recognition of specific targets, recognition under those targets of the specific barriers that women and girls face to actually realising those the target objectives. So there is, it's not as comprehensive as we would have liked, but it does exist to some extent. But I think when you're making an assessment of whether it meets human rights standards, whether it's a good thing for taking women and girls' human rights forward, you have to look at what's not there as well. So let's start with the title of the goal: achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. What's obviously missing is women's human rights and women and girls' human rights. So there is no reference to human rights in the title of this goal. And there was a big push all the way through from the women's major group, from many players, to have that recognised in the actual title of the goal, and that didn't materialise. And I don't think it was in any draft, actually. So that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of the barriers. So there's no women's rights reference in the title. There's no explicit commitment to sexual rights either. Under target 5.6, we have okay language, and actually when you talk to the sexual and reproductive health and rights coalitions, they say, they didn't expect to get sexual rights in there, so they are, they're pragmatic and they're happy with what they got, but it didn't get the full recognition of reproductive and sexual health and rights that we would have wanted in there. There is a complete lack of mention of LGBT and queer rights at all in this whole framework. In fact, there were, in the last negotiations in July, there was really an explicit changing of language. So every time they mention gender equality, they mention gender equality and empowerment of women and girls. And so that was a deliberate ploy to make sure that gender equality didn't extend to equality for LGBT rights. And that came in really at the end. That came in July. So that's the kind of so it's not progressive at all in that respect. And then you need to look at the caveats that are in place, that were in place, and I've highlighted them a little bit in bold. So where we've got targets that at the end of the target it says as nationally appropriate or in accordance with national laws. Obviously these things are going to be in the countries where they're needed most. There's not going to be the national laws that are so progressive that would allow for some of this stuff to actually happen. There were more of these throughout the whole framework, and so they did come out. Some of them did get negotiated out at the last minute, which was really positive, including what did come out, and I haven't got it up here, which was a reference to gender equality, women and girls empowerment within the realm of the family. So it was relating the two together. That came out, which is a real positive for gender equality and women's and girls' human rights. So there are some big gaps which we have to acknowledge and and continue to work with. It's easy to focus just on goals and targets, and in fact that is the place that most people are going to focus. Actually, all of their attention is going to go on goals, targets, and then when we get them, the indicators. But this is, unlike the MDGs, this has quite a few chapters that make up the Sustainable Development Goals and this Agenda 2030. And I think for those of us who want to keep working, like Savio says, on the next 1 to 2 years on making sure that the ambition of the whole framework is really embedded, we need to look at other aspects. We need to look at the preamble, we need to look at the introduction, which kind of sets the tone for the agenda. We need to look at the goals and the targets, but also the sections on means of implementation, on accountability, and on indicators. And even where they're weak, we have to use what we can out of them and use that leverage. For gender equality and women and girls' human rights, actually looking at the political declaration and the introductory sections, the preamble, is really necessary, because in here we have some good language that talks about the protecting all human rights and promotion of gender equality and empowerment of women and girls. In particular, paragraph 20, where it acknowledges that the achievement of full human potential and of sustainable development is not possible if one half of humanity continues to be denied its full human rights and opportunities. So this is the sort of language that we have to make sure that governments and any implementers, whether they're civil society, private sector, governments, really recognise, and that they put this into their mind when they're deciding on which targets to implement and how to implement. These are leverage points that we need to use. I think, again, at a time when women's human rights just generally across the board are under attack, this sort of global agreement that we've just been able to get has to be positive in some senses. It still was agreed by the 195 or so governments in the UN, and we have to use it as just the most recent language that we can negotiate with. We were asked to think about the SDGs in relation to other human rights instruments as well, and so I wanted to just acknowledge that for a lot of people working on gender equality and women and girls' human rights, there is a real acknowledgement that the SDGs is by no means the kind of pinnacle of what we would like to see or what we already have in terms of women and girls' human rights. There are other instruments. They are much more comprehensive, and in particular the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, still goes beyond and is still more comprehensive than what we have in the SDGs. So we can't ignore, we shouldn't ignore Beijing, and we shouldn't allow governments or implementers to ignore Beijing, and we should make sure that they're not consumed or they're not subsumed. I think women's rights organisations, and some that I talk to, particularly in trying to prepare for this, are really worried of how you actually get the SDGs to kind of work up to meet the Beijing language, to meet the Beijing aspirations. And Beijing, again, was where reproductive health and rights was quite at the forefront. It has this really great language in there around human rights of women and girls, and the girl child are inalienable, integral, and indivisible parts of universal human rights. That kind of powerful language doesn't exist. And there is a acknowledgement that in this day and age, this year, or these last few years, we haven't been able to negotiate something as as progressive as Beijing, which was put together in 1995. So that's a bit of a worry and something that we all need to reflect on and think about why and how we avoid that. There's also other things, obviously CEDAW, which is recognised through Beijing as well, and the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 around women, peace and security, which I think might be covered a little later. These things are important instruments and we can't forget them, and we shouldn't let them be subsumed by SDG focus. And I think that's a particular challenge for civil society just as much for anyone else, because we all jump and we all want to celebrate what we do have, but we can't forget where it's lacking or where it doesn't go far enough and where we need to keep reminding of other things that exist. But despite Beijing being agreed in 1995 and some amazing language, we have to acknowledge that we still are where we are. We still don't have human rights for all women and girls. Beijing has not been implemented in the way it should have been. It hasn't made the progress that it should have had by now. So we have to, I think, when you make an assessment, not just look at language. I think the language is the least barrier we have now. Actually, the biggest barrier in all of these agreements, whether it's Beijing, whether it's SDGs, whether it's CEDAW, is actually implementation and action. It's not language. We have great language everywhere on statutes and legislation and agreements, but actually it's the implementation that is failing. So the Gender and Development Network, along with GAPS and the Sexual and Reproductive Health Coalition, did this report in March this year, and they looked at what are the biggest gaps, what are the challenges, and trying to highlight that to try and inform how we look at SDG implementation. And some of the things that came out really was that inequality and continued denial of women and girls' human rights exists because of deeply entrenched social norms. It doesn't exist necessarily because not enough girls go into school or because the healthcare access is not there. It's deeper than that. It's more structural than that. It's why they can't go to school in the first place, why they can't access the healthcare in the first place, the value that society puts on women and girls as opposed to men and boys. So we need to, any new framework, any implementation plan has to look at social norms, which is much harder, which is much longer term. There's an inconsistent application of rights and commitments. So like I said, Beijing's not been implemented in every country. There's not been the take-up that there should have been, even though there was agreement by so many countries. Thirdly, the rhetoric is nowhere near matched by resources, and this is a big challenge that the SDGs will have as well. As Savio said, the financing agreement that should have come with it didn't. So in ODA commitment, for example, in 2012, only 21% of ODA went to spending with an element of gender equality focus on it, and within that, only 3% was allocated to projects with gender equality as a principal objective. So it's still a really lowly funded area of development work, and this will always kind of mean that progress can't be made in the way that it should be made. I think also funding for women's rights organisations and women's rights ministries and even things like UN Women is still severely neglected and they're all under-resourced, and these are the kinds of institutions that we need to do this work to really do it in the way that looks at women and girls' human rights in the proper sense. So there's a lack of matching of rhetoric and resources. And then number 4 is where there's a lack of focus on collective rights and underlying causes and too much focus on individual access, so an individual woman's access to a particular development aim. So for example, the MDGs is massively critiqued for trying to just focus on getting girls into school but not looking at anything around it, not looking at the structures. And even with the SDGs today, we see a tendency towards instrumentalist approach. In fact, I think we see more and more of a tendency towards instrumentalist approaches, and increasingly in a place like the UK as well, where we think about gender equality, women and girls' human rights, and in relation to how it can advance society as a whole, or how it can lead to better economic outputs for a country, better GDP, better everything. And we're not necessarily just focusing on it. It's a human right. It is, important in and of itself. So we need to be careful about that. So I think it's hard to say that these will be fixed by the SDGs. In fact, we see some same trends emerging in the SDGs. But like Savio says, I think we have the next few years when we think about implementation, when we think about national action plans, when we think about monitoring and review mechanisms, and in particularly the indicators, we have to learn from what we've learned from Beijing and from the MDGs and try and make sure that some of these barriers are not there.
Thank you very much, Priya. I think it's a real testament to you and your colleagues that there is such a dramatic difference between the SDGs and MDGs on gender and women and girls. So that's to be applauded. But I think an important reminder from a human rights-based approach is about looking at those root causes as well as you're talking about social norms and trying to achieve implementation. Thank you. I'd like to invite Phil now to say some comments from the perspective of conflict and peace building, please.
Great, thanks. Well, thanks for inviting me. Thanks for the first two presentations. So I think I interpreted your questions, Corinne, as follows, but I think roughly what you intended. One was, where is peace and conflict in the SDGs? Second one was, why don't we see more of them in the SDGs? I think. And then, how can human rights tools help prevent conflicts and tensions linked to the SDGs and the implementation of it? So where is peace and conflict in the SDGs? Clearly there's goal 16, which was up there, and it's peace and justice and several other good things as well. That we were really happy to see that in there. That was one of the things which China and some other countries were quite keen to not have. I've been confident in the UK government right from the beginning of this process. We actually withdrew from a lot of the advocacy as an organisation, because we felt early on in discussions with Number 10 and with DFID and the FCO that actually there was a huge commonality between what we wanted, or what we wanted to see as a minimum in there, and what this government wanted. And clearly as an NGO we had almost no voice compared to the UK, which is a P5 member. So very happy with seeing goal 16 in there, which wasn't always clear it was going to be. But I would say, if the question is where is peace and conflict in the SDGs, where is peace in the SDGs? It's actually everywhere. Because if you think about peace as being the idea of positive peace, which if you're not familiar with it, people talk about, negative peace is when people are not fighting anymore. Positive peace is when they are making progress as a society without violence, and acknowledging and recognizing and managing and resolving their differences without violence. Then clearly, in order to have that positive peace, you need economic development, you need equality of development and participation, you need women and everyone else to have a voice. So the SDGs, they're weird, they're skewed. Some things get lots of mention, others like peace just get a small mention. But they're in most things that one would want to have in a place where peace is positive are in there. So I think I celebrate that. I think it's fantastic. I hated the MDGs with a vengeance. I wrote a diatribe against them in 2010. I thought they were perversely incentivizing wrong use of resources. You both referred to that already. They chose a few things. They absolutely traduced the idea of the Millennium Declaration, which was a really powerful declaration. They were the things which were being measured from 1990 and 1991 and 2 onwards, which were just carried forward because they could do them. It wasn't because they were the most important things at all, and I just hated them. And I think the SDGs are such a huge improvement. It's fantastic for that. So where is conflict in them? Also everywhere. Because if the SDGs work, we will get development. Hopefully it will become sustained, therefore it will have been sustainable. I find the word sustainable an odd one because you can't really know until it's happened. But development is progress, but it's also difficult. If I've got power and resources, development means someone else is likely to be getting some power and resources. And whether it's true or not that it's a zero-sum game, it's likely that I'm going to think it's a zero-sum game, and I'm going to want to defend my power and access to resources. So development is a good thing, but development as a process is rife with conflict. So all the way through the SDGs, including what we were just talking about, there's a lot of resistance to gender equality. That's conflict. It'll have to be violent, but it often is. So we have to recognize that development is a conflictual or conflicted process. We have to manage that and get through it. So conflict is all the way through the SDGs if they work. Because conflict doesn't have to be violent, it just means differences. If it works well, it'll be peaceful development, but clearly it won't always be peaceful because history hasn't always been peaceful. So I think peace is all the way through the concept, even though not that visible, and conflict is all the way through the concept, although not at all visible, because development sort of requires conflict. And I think everyone's job who thinks about this is to try and make sure that development happens in a way in which conflict is managed in a non-violent way and progress is made. So peace is everywhere, and conflict is also everywhere. That's quite important, I think. Second question, why don't we see more peace and conflict in the SDGs? Well, in a way, I've just said they are right throughout, but they're not visible. I think partly because of politics. What I just mentioned about conflict being an essential part of development, that's either not recognised by lots of people who think about development, or it is recognised, and for probably quite good reasons they prefer not to dwell on that. And so the conflict side of it is not very visible in the SDGs for various sort of political reasons. It makes it difficult to discuss these things. If we say that development is conflictual, it gives credence to some of the governments which didn't really want the SDGs to be as comprehensive anyway. So there's a political reason for not talking about that too much while the agreement is being got. But now the agreement is got, we can, I think, reveal that development is difficult and conflicted and can lead to violence. I think why peace is not more visible is just it's still seen rather as a niche thing. I mean, we were pretty happy that Goal 16 was there and one part of Goal 16. I mean, Goal 16 has really the most important public goods in it, just in one little goal: good governance, justice, and peace. But they're seen as niche in the development sector, in the world generally. They certainly aren't, it seems to me. They are one of the ones which really do deserve the attribute of a goal, I think, because you can't really do peace. You can do justice, and you can sort of do good governance, but actually they're things that you attain rather than things that you do. So I think, well, to be discussed. So I think that's why peace is not so easily visible. I mean, yes, I've said enough on that, I think, already. So third point, how can human rights tools be useful with respect to these? I think a few points that I did want to make there. One is, let's be clear, the SDGs are fundamentally anti-democratic. I read the newspaper. I'm an avid consumer of news. My government has just signed this country up to a universal set of goals which we will have to report on, we will have to take seriously. I don't see Parliament discussing that. My belief is that Parliament should make these decisions. Now, I'm for the SDGs, but there's something fundamentally anti-democratic about the idea that a bunch of people in New York should come together and decide on these 169 things. So the world is full of compromise. I'm comfortable with that, despite what it may have seemed like what I just said. But that tells me that these things are just what they are. I don't think you can implement the SDGs. That's not the verb I would use. They're a framework for thinking about progress. One reason I really like them is there are so many targets, 169, that despite this indicator business which is coming up, nobody is going to be able to tell anybody to implement them all. Actually, that's not true. There are some people who will be able to do that. It's citizens of countries which want them to be implemented. So if the SDGs are somehow anti-democratic in their sort of top-downness, they're a fantastic tool for citizens in countries which want to prioritise things that are important to them, even all 169 if they so wish. And that includes human rights activists, to say, when it comes to election time, hold on a minute, we've signed up to these goals. This political party, what are you going to do about the SDGs, which this country has signed up to? So it gives campaigners, human rights campaigners and other campaigners all over the world, a really interesting hook for their campaigning. And then, this is where the SDGs become, I think they're apolitical right now, but they've become political. Because no one can implement 169 targets or meet 169 targets. What is politics? It's the art of prioritising. So, in this country, which of these 169 do we think are important? Those who are citizens or voters here. Which ones do we think are important here? That's a really interesting public argument to be making. That's something I can lobby my MP on. That's something at election time I can say, well, hold on a minute. You've missed gender equality. What are you going to do about that? And of course, the UK has two sets of responsibilities, like every country. One is the universal responsibility to be paying attention to these goals globally. The other one is they apply to this country. They don't just apply to poor countries, they apply to every country. That's what's been signed up to. And so they are amazing political tools for human rights campaigners. As to which human rights sort of tools I would use, I'm not the person here with the most expertise on that, but I would think that because they are so problematic, as you two have both expressed, from a human rights perspective, while being a glass half full, it seems to me that the sort of not so much the tool, but the model of duty bearer, so duty bearer and rights holder, that comes into play. So a lens through which to look at these 169. One can hold governments to account for the attention they are paying to the goals, and one can do that in a way which sort of respects the differential priority of the various goals and targets in a given country. So I think in a way they're a grey area, as you said, but in a way that's the area of politics. Of course, I'm a peace builder, so we are completely familiar with working in a grey area. Every area is grey for us. So I would say that, wouldn't I? But I think they're immensely powerful. And I think the thing to do now is just not so much to spend time worrying about turning them into normative things which can get implemented. I think that actually that would be a waste of time to some degree, because they never will be implemented as such. I think the thing now is to make sure that in countries where human rights are the least fulfilled and where there is the most to play for, we should all be doing as much as we can to make sure people know about these things. So come the next election time, because most countries do have elections now, come next election time, citizens can be using the SDGs as something with which to frame their desiderata, what we want when it comes to election time, and ask different candidates, say, what are you going to do about these issues? Because, by the way, we are citizens of the country which has signed up to these goals. So I think there's something really quite powerful in the fact that they are there. They are there, but I don't think they're going to be norms, actually. They're not norms, they're goals and targets. And I would finish on one thing. I'm quite worried about the indicators, because once we get to indicators, they won't be right for almost any country in the world, because indicators, there's an economics law, Goodhart's law, I don't know if you teach it here, which is, I think it translates into sort of away from the equations as soon as a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a useful measure. And it's about perverse incentives, essentially. It's particularly important in economics, I think, but in any field it's important. Now, it's not really a problem in a family, because you can see what the measure is and you can discuss it. It's a bit more of a problem in the community. It starts to be a problem at a provincial level. It's a problem at a national level. And it's a problem to the power of problem at a global level. Because there's no way that people can know what is the right indicator in Bangkok for 7+ billion people. So I think we need to be very careful about the indicators. And that's the sort of thing which can lead, to go back to the questions, can lead to conflicts, I think. So that's...
Okay, thank you very much, Phil. I think one important point that I take there is the need to localize the SDGs framework, particularly because, as you say, the accountability structures at the national level are much stronger than what we have internationally. And so I think that's an important reminder. And also, as Savio said, that these are for the global north and the global south. This is no longer something over there that we in the UK can ignore. So I'd like to invite Neva, last but not least, to talk about the very important pillar of environmental issues that are predominant in the SDGs.
So thanks Corinne. Hi everyone, my name's Neva. I work for CAFOD, which is the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, and you'll see a bit more about that in a few seconds when I move on to the next slide. But as Corinne said, she invited me to speak a little bit about the SDGs and the environmental SDGs, particularly in human rights. And I'm going to look at it in 3 different ways. One is about the kind of conceptually approaching the environmental SDGs, and there's also the concept of sustainable development. The second is around constituencies and communities who engage within these debates. And then thirdly is around the content itself of the goals and targets. So when I first kind of was set this exam question a little bit, I actually struggled quite a lot in how to think about the environmental SDGs, and I realised that it was because it was looking at the environment as something other than us. It was really falling into that separation of environment, people and the economy as 3 separate things, that kind of 3 separate pillars, which is how sustainable development has always been described previously. So, being part of a Catholic organisation, where did I turn to? The Pope, who has recently been saying some really interesting things about the way that humanity relates to the environment. So first of all, this is kind of approaching it from a conceptual perspective. The Pope spoke at the UN General Assembly on the 25th of September, literally the hour before the whole post-2015 circus shenanigans began. And what he spoke about was the right of the environment. Is one of the things. He spoke about a lot of different things, but one of the things was about the right of the environment and asserting that there is the right of the environment. And he made two reasons behind this. One is that as humans, we are part of the environment. We are in no way separate from the natural world. So he's really moving away from the notion that we can somehow separate off who we are as these kind of human physical beings with this kind of broader natural world, and any idea that we can live independently of what happens to the environment. And he talks a lot about how any harm that's done to the environment is actually harm that's done to humanity. And then he gets a little bit more esoteric and talks about how every living thing, every creature has an intrinsic value in its very existence, in its life, its beauty, and its interdependence and relationship with other creatures. So I want to kind of have that as the conceptual framework that I'm approaching this from, that it's not we can separate who we are as people in this kind of hierarchy of humans sitting at the top in this kind of egoistic approach, but coming to a more kind of ecological understanding of who we are as people. And what the Pope does with this kind of new way of framing our existence is to say that the cry of the earth, the environmental catastrophes, the climate crises, the environmental degradation and destruction that we see is no different from the cry of the poor that we see when human rights are abused, when people suffer from poverty, from hunger, from exclusion. So he's saying those two things are very much the same thing, and for us to try and separate them out into an environmental set of goals and a kind of socially human-focused set of goals and then an economic set of goals is the wrong approach. He does apply it to the kind of whole Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, but probably not in that much detail. Not being a policy person himself. Well, actually, he was a huge policy person when I was talking. So, if you read any of his stuff, he's really into his policy. But what he said, one of the quotes that comes from his recent encyclical Laudato Si is that the selfish and boundless thirst for power and material prosperity leads to both the misuse of available natural resources and to the exclusion of the weak and disadvantaged. So there can't be any separation between the abuses of the environment and of people who are powerless or disenfranchised. And so this is my rationale behind the fact that there are no environmental goals. And for us to try and pigeonhole the goals into different areas is really problematic and is actually kind of, I would say, moving us back to a more MDG approach than really taking us forwards to where the SDGs have the potential to take us. From a more pragmatic perspective, people who are living in poverty often depend more on natural resources for their daily attainment of basic rights, whether that's around food, around shelter, around water. So if you're damaging those natural resources, you're damaging their ability to achieve and maintain those very basic human rights. The final part of the kind of conceptual piece that I want to talk about is about the kind of big conceptual shifts that have happened from the MDGs and to the SDGs. And a number of the previous speakers have already spoken about some of these things, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. The one thing I would disagree with Phil a little bit, which always makes it more interesting than everyone on the panel saying exactly the same thing, is I think that the SDGs are normative. They very much shape development discourse if in any way they proceed as the MDGs do and have the same kind of impact as the MDGs do, that they are going to have a huge normative impact. And I think there are influence. There are 3 different areas where I feel like human rights language has had a really strong impact, even if it's not saying specifically human rights. The first is this concept about universality. This is that all goals, as Phil alluded to, are applicable to all countries. So it's as much relevance to us here in the UK as it does to Malawi or Bolivia or any other developing country. And I think this is really important from a political perspective and from the perspective of somebody who's engaged with these negotiations over the last 3 years, is that I hate this phrase, but it levels the playing field a little bit. It means that there has to be an element of humility from the UK, countries like the UK and the US. And when Obama gave his speech at the summit, one of the things that he talked about was the difficulty of attaining equality within the US. And he was talking about difficulty in attaining equality of education, of health, all of these massive factors that we know are a huge problem in the US. anytime I've ever seen Obama speak before at the UN, it's always been this really bullying, we've got it right, you guys have got it wrong, listen to us. He did then also go and do that in the general debate at UNGA. But for this moment, he was actually kind of taking a much more humble approach, and for me, that's an incredible step forwards. The second area where there's been a really big conceptual shift is around the concepts of indivisibility and interdependence. And for me, that's a really strong human rights concept that's coming through there. And that's the idea that the whole agenda should be applied together. You're not looking at kind of, we're just going to work on a siloed approach to HIV and AIDS. We're looking at health system strengthening and how that relates to gender, how that relates to work, how that relates to a lot of the other issues. And I feel like this is incredibly important in that approach, so that the kind of traditionally more environmental goals, particularly around climate change, marine and terrestrial ecosystems, are not forgotten. You need to have a look at what's happening to that broader picture whilst you're making specific interventions on different areas, whatever they may be. And the third is around integration. I've talked about this a little bit before, but bringing together those social, environmental and economic dimensions of sustainable development. This is the first time, I think, that the UN or governments at the UN have tried to bring together such an integrated approach across such a broad range of development issues. And for that reason, it is not perfect. I think a few other speakers have already mentioned this. I mean, from the gender perspective, it's obvious where there are areas of tension and inconsistency, but one that really concerns me is that the way that economic growth is framed within the SDGs. Goal 8 is on decent work or decent employment and economic growth, and I think the target is around pushing for 6% GDP growth every year on year for every country, which is absolutely ridiculous. If you think about it, actually, the growth has nothing to do with poverty eradication or reduction of inequality, and it's entirely because our current model of economy is completely natural resource dependent. It's not environmentally sustainable. So I think that for me is one of the big areas where, as civil society, we really failed to address the whole economic issue and how that was being approached. And if you look at what's going to happen over the next 15 years, economic decision making trumps social and environmental decision making. We totally externalize social and environmental costs for economic reasons. And I'm sure that over the next 15 years, unless we have a significant change in the way that the world works, that's something that we're going to see. And then I think probably the final point to re-emphasize is just that this isn't just about in developing countries. I'm going to talk a little bit about constituencies and communities. By constituencies, I mean the different kind of professional groups that I came across working on the post-2015 agenda in the SDGs. I was part of Beyond 2015, as were some of my other colleagues here as well, and it was an incredible learning experience for me, because instead of just working with people who were very specifically from development and worked on my specific approach to development, we had to sit down around a table and learn what it meant to the gender community, to the environmental community, to the human rights community, to the peace and conflict community. And there were some really challenging conversations when you get those groups together. One of the things that I realised is how incredibly divided our institutions are around the world, whether you're talking about government, international institutions like the UN or the EU, or you're talking about civil society. Our structures internally are very much focused on different areas, and we find it difficult to have this integrated approach. So I feel like from moving this forward, how we're going to make that happen over the next 15 years, I think is a huge challenge to all of us, whether we work in institutions like government or institutions like civil society. I also want to talk a little bit about the perspective that we heard from communities as it relates to like the experience of environmental abuses. We did a piece of research back in 2012 between Beyond 2015 and the Institute of Development Studies down in Sussex, which tried to understand what people's experience of change over the last 15 years had been. Like, there's no point in going and saying, did you meet MDG 1? But trying to have a kind of more nuanced conversation and understand what happened. CAFOD did work specifically in the Philippines with one of our partners called EcoWeb. And what we found when we spoke to the communities there is that for them, there is no separation between environmental and human rights abuses. They highlighted the principles of free, prior and informed consent, and that environmental laws and indigenous rights were not adequately implemented either by state or by companies, particularly within the context of mining companies and their negative impacts on local populations. And it was often local people who paid the long-term negative costs for the activities of mining companies in the area. They also raised issues around how bribery was used by companies to relax the enforcement of environmental regulation. So very much bringing in all of those issues that are so central to human rights around participation, around accountability, transparency, access to information. So from a kind of community level, people who are the communities, the people we hope will benefit from this in the long run, they don't see any separation between these different areas. The final part that I'm going to talk about is actually the goals and targets themselves. Obviously, the initial temptation that I'm going to fall into right now is to look at goals 13, 14 and 15, which for simplification of communication we've called action on climate change, healthy oceans and sustainable ecosystems. Obviously, climate change is a human rights issue, and the OHCHR have been calling for a human rights-based approach to be applied throughout the climate negotiations and the approach that the UN takes to addressing climate change for global policies. The second one around healthy oceans, I've looked at there's been a joint report between the High Commission, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights and the United Nations Environment Programme, where they look at the linkages between human rights and environmental protection as multidimensional and reciprocal. And so if we're talking about not the kind of let's meet target XYZ, but looking at how we address the ecosystems which support us on this planet, then it's evident that we need a human rights-based approach. But finally, I'd like to just drill down into target 1.4 under ending poverty for all, which is that by 2030, ensure that all men and women, particularly the poor and vulnerable, have equal rights to economic resources, as well as access to basic services, ownership and control over land, and other forms of property, inheritance, natural resources, and appropriate new technology and financial services, including microfinance. So if you look at the kind of breadth of issues that are contained within that target, central elements are related to the natural world and the environment that which they exist in, which people exist in. So I think if we're looking at achieving the SDGs from an environmentally human rights-based approach, it's really important that we don't just look at those kind of big headlines, but we look down into what's mainstream, to what's integrated across the different goals and targets, to really work out how we can deliver positive impacts for people living in poverty who are most closely connected to the natural world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neva. I think one point that I really stands out for me is how, as Savio said at the beginning, there's these siloed approaches across institutions and themes, and you have highlighted how at the level of the community those things are all integrated. There are no sides. That's part of the lived experience of what these SDGs are trying to address. I think that's an important point for us to end on from the point of view of participation as well, which is a key human rights-based approach dimension.